I'd like to start with talking about the way your brain works.
Well, I'm an absolute visual thinker. Everything I think about is a picture. And if you look at the HBO movie Temple Grandin, it shows exactly how I think. It's pictures. If you ask me, as you go grocery shopping today, I'm seeing the two supermarkets I go to.
Hmm.
You see, it's not in words, it's in pictures. Now I've still got the supermarkets on my mind. Now I'm walking around in them now.
Hmm.
I'm kind of switching back and forth between the two of them. Looked at some oranges just the other day. I thought they didn't look very nice, so I'm going to go to the other market to buy them. And I'm just seeing that right now. Just a real simple example. I
Yeah.
go, they're small, they're kind of green. I go, nah, I don't want to buy those. And I'm seeing them again now that I looked at them yesterday and I really did not like them.
Hmm. So, could you describe your thinking pattern? Like, if a thought comes into your head, because I watched the movie and I thought
Well, why don't you
it
ask
was
me
a really
something
good
more
job, but
specific than a thought coming into my head? Because then I start seeing like cartoons and they have a little bubble of writing over the person's head.
hmm.
See that.
Okay, so you take the word that you're hearing and then you match a picture to it.
Well, yeah, and then you see a word like the. I just see it like written with a Sharpie on a piece of paper
Hmm.
because it doesn't really have any meaning. It's just, I call it a filler word. You just put it in there for the grammar.
Yeah. And how about if you're thinking of a story, like a sequence, does it play out like a video for you?
Yeah, I play it like a video, and I don't handle sequence all that well. In fact, if let's say I had a job at a restaurant and I got to take some equipment apart and wash it and put it back together again. When I first started, make myself a checklist of the order of the events. I just write down a little checklist, sort of like a pilot's checklist for, take this equipment apart, clean it, put it back together again. Because I'm not a verbal person at all. But being a visual person is really a benefit for work with animals because animals are sensory based thinkers. They're not word based thinkers. They live in a sensory based world. So if you want to understand an animal, you've got to get away from verbal language. Now, when I was young, I thought everybody thought in pictures. I didn't know that I thought differently. I thought everybody thought the way I did. It wasn't until I got in my 30s that I got any inkling that other people did not think in pictures.
What made you realize?
Well, I was at a conference and I got talking to speech therapists and I got to talking about how we think. Now, if I say to most people, think about your own home or think about the office where you work, you're so familiar with that. Most people will see that visually. But when I ask you something you don't own, but it's out there in the environment, most people don't pay that much attention to it, like church steeples. When you ask me that question, I see specific ones. I start naming them off. I asked the speech therapist, and she just did the most vague. I'll show you what she did. She did a very vague thing like this. Just all that for her, a church steeple was just this. Where for me, I'm seeing the different churches.
Hmm. So I just want to describe what you drew for people who are listening to it and don't see
Well,
the video.
what drew was just a steep triangle with two black lines. Just a
Hmm.
very, very steep triangle with two lines. Pointy thing, she said.
Yeah.
And it was very vague. And then there's degrees of visual thinking. You'll get some people, well, they'll see something more detailed, but they don't identify it. The visual thinker will usually start naming off the churches. They'll just start naming off where they're at. And they come up into their mind like a series of PowerPoint slides.
Hmm. But people can be kind of a mixed, right?
Yeah, people can be a mix. In fact, most people are kind of a mix. But then you get some people that are autistic, or some people are just really mathematical. You get extremes. In fact, there's been research on what's called an object visualizer and a visual spatial. Now, an object visualizer is how I think in specific pictures. The visual spatial, that's more the mathematical mind. In fact, I've written about that in my book, The Autistic Brain. I've covered some of the research. That book was published in 2013, And now there's been a lot more research on object visualization and visual spatial. They are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes researchers mix them together, and they should not be mixed together.
Yeah.
And so that kind of messes up a lot of studies. But that's actually based in science. And when you have them in the extremes, they're kind of opposite skills. You're not going to find an extreme object visualizer in the same person that's like a super, super good mathematician.
Interesting. And what are some ways that these different brains can work together?
Well, let's take something simple like interfaces for, like Zoom, for example. One of the reasons why Zoom got all the business is I didn't have to have a degree in engineering to use Zoom. It was easy to use. In fact, I read about the history of Zoom. The original founder worked for another company, and he wanted to upgrade the interface, and they didn't want to do it. And now I've noticed that when I go to the other platforms, they're all copying Zoom now. And sometimes I forget which one I'm on. It's just a slight difference in the icons and things like that, down on the bottom. But you see, the object visualizer would make the interface easy to use. Now, all the code, that programming is done by the mathematical mind, by the visual spatial. So you need the two together. Mm-hmm. Let's look at something like the iPhone. Steve Jobs was an artist. That's why it's easy to use. The programmers had to make the phone actually work. So these are places where the two different kinds of minds can complement. They have complementary skills. Because when the programmers design the interfaces, they usually put too many features on it. It's too complicated, and nobody can figure out how to use it.
Mm-hmm. So, Temple, you mentioned that your ability to think in pictures helped you empathize with the experience of animals. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's easier to imagine what something would be like for an animal. The very, very first work I ever did with cattle was out in the Arizona feedlots. And I went around to all these different feedlots, and I handled cattle going through the raceways for vaccinations. And I noticed they would stop at a shadow. They'd stop at a coat on a fence. They'd see a reflection off a vehicle bumper. Things that we tend to not notice, those animals were noticing. Nobody else noticed this. And at this time, when I was in my 20s, I thought everybody thought in pictures. I didn't realize that my thinking was different. And it was just totally obvious to me.
Mm-hmm.
What they were seeing. And nobody else was doing that at the time.
You've been watching Autism Knows No Borders. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so let us know what you think in the comments section. Click here to watch this interview in its entirety. You can also find us on your favorite podcast app. Tune in each week for engaging conversations of how people across the globe are inspiring change and building community. Thanks for watching. Take care.